Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of ModGear. This week we drive the very famous and very well known Nissan Skyline R34 GT-R, an absolute legend of a car with its nicknamed Godzilla, because you know, people don't know their nicknames. So let's just get right into it. But before we begin this week's episode, let's take a step back in the past for a brief history lesson. Our story of the Skyline begins, surprisingly enough, in the late 1960s and very much into the early 1970s. It was at this time that the Skyline was born as, well, a 4-door sedan. I'm so sorry to every single JDM fan watching this video. It had a measly 2-liter S20 inline-6 engine making a measly 160 horsepower. Back then, it wasn't really that big of a deal, and it was actually pretty okay for the time. But this generation, in particular, which is the next one I'm going to talk about, is the one that we're after the most. The third generation, or commonly known as the R32 Skyline GT-R, had a much better 2.6-liter RB26 inline engine. Inline engine? Yeah, that's funny. No, an inline 6, or a straight 6, whatever God knows you want to call it, making a little over 270 horsepower to the rear wheels, and this was mostly to the street-legal ones, the civilian? Yeah, I can't speak apparently. With some of the track ones around that time making probably around double that, I would say maybe a little over 300, because again, Nissan was actually using these cars for track racing. More specifically in track racing, I mean the Group A racing where, you know, cars, Ferraris, McLarens, that kind of thing. And coming came the fourth generation where, let's face it, hardly anything actually changed, other than the R33 race cars having surprisingly similar power to those Ferraris and McLarens. Nissan, are you okay? And then, in the year 1999, also commonly known as the Age of the Fast and Furious, it happened once more. The fifth and final generation of the classic old-school Skylines, commonly known as this video, is the R34, made its debut right at the start of 1990 in January, using, once again, the legendary RB26 engine. However, this time making around similar power to the Toyota Supra at the time, around 300 horsepower, either slightly below it or slightly over it. It just naturally depends. And similar to the Supra from last week's video, if you haven't seen that, then go look at that. But as I said in that video, the Supra's engine was very well known for being able to put hundreds upon hundreds of horsepower into it, making, with more modded out Supras making around 1,000 horsepower or more. And the same story goes for the Skyline and most RB26 engines, with being able to withstand hundreds upon hundreds of horsepower. And while most of these cars can pull 1,000 horsepower, most tuners usually don't go for that region, and they go for the neighborhood of around 600 to maybe 900, because, well, let's face it, their engines. In fact, this car was just insane as a whole. In fact, it was so insane that it was actually banned in the United States because the Skyline GT-R was actually too fast for the police here in the United States to actually keep up with them. That's how you know this car was insane. But anyway, with that history lesson out of the way, then we can get on to this week's video. Take it away, Panda. Thank you, Mr. History Panda. And with that, we can start today's tests, starting with the top speed test. Welcome to the Genesis 1 Mile Dragway. It's a place where many cars come to push their engines, and, well, most of their speeds, to their limit, simply to put their speeds onto the boards. So let's see how the R34 GT-R, or Skyline, I don't really know how you pronounce it these days, can do in this test. Skyline, or R34 again, whatever you want to call it, topped out at a measly 79.3 miles per hour. It's a bit unfortunate for this car, but let's face it, we all know what it can really do, right? Next up is the brake-tastically, wow, butchered that sentence, is the brake-tastically fun brake test. Most cars in this season will deploy their rear brakes once they cross this white line. The goal of the test is to not hit the parked Nissan Leaf, and if you do, you basically just want to measure your distance to see how far, you're sent flying from where the Nissan Leaf is parked. It's pretty self-explanatory. The Skyline did pretty well in this test. While it didn't necessarily go super far out from where the Nissan Leaf was parked, it definitely made sure that these brakes are very strong, but that's mostly because, again, most of the weight and most of the car's, speed was transferred in that Nissan Leaf, so therefore it stopped much quicker than, say, the Supra, for example. But it still did pretty well in this test. Next up on our test for this week is the cornering test. And to do that, I've come here. This is the Forksville Test Circuit. Developed by the ModGear development team, it's held to make sure to test cars on their cornering, through corners, through tight bends, and jumps. I forgot to mention jumps last episode, but you get the point, there's jumps. And we're going to be seeing how well the Skyline can handle through tight bends and cornering to see how well they can maintain speeds. The Skyline actually performed really well on this course, being that it can take most corners with ease while still at least going full throttle, and body roll and a loss of speed in cornering isn't really a big problem in this car. So therefore, it's a great run from the Skyline. Next up is the very infamous parallel park test. The goal of this test is very simple. We want to make sure that we can park this car going in reverse in between these two parked Renault Meganes. But we want to make sure that there's equal space for someone to walk through the cars. Pretty self-explanatory. And after this test, the Skyline proved that it can definitely do a parallel park, so a very good job on this test. Next up is everyone's favorite, maybe, and that is the gravel road segment. This test is used to help test a car's endurance on daily driving conditions that most drivers will face, whether it be potholes, bumps in roads, that kind of thing. So, how well does the Skyline ride in day-to-day conditions? The Skyline doesn't really do a good job on bumps at all. It is extremely wobbly, and you're basically going to feel every bump as if you're being punched in the face. It's not a good run from the Skyline, but it all depends on the area you live in. If there isn't bumps or anything like that, this can be fine. But if you're living especially in a bumpy area, then, well, say goodbye to your back. Up next is, well, I can't really explain it, it's the bump test. The bump test is made so that cars can be able to test their abilities over things like speed bumps and larger bumps versus things like potholes and stuff like that. So this mostly is a work seeing if cars can scrape their front ends and just how well they tackle very large bumps. So let's see how well the Skyline does in this test. This car, I have now concluded, is so bad at bumps that I actually nearly stopped driving the car after this test. If you want a front end that is going to be completely gray in less than a day by, of course, scraping, this is the car to do it. A very, very horrible attempt from the Skyline. Next up on our tests is the slalom test. The slalom test, as I said before in the cornering test, is used to help judge how a car's body roll is distributed through weight distribution, and to help prove the loss of speed through cornering. We already know that the Skyline does pretty well at this, but we're going to go ahead and test it again anyway, so let's see how well the Skyline does in the slalom test. As stated in the cornering test again, body roll doesn't really affect the Skyline whatsoever, and it really does show here. You're not losing that much speed in cornering. However, what I did notice was that the turning radius on tight corners is a little bit over the top because you do have to turn it a bit more, but that's normal from a car like this. So, therefore, a good run from the R34. I actually had quite a hard time finding the MPG figures for this car. But after some digging, I found that the Skyline does somewhere around 19 MPG to 24 MPG in the city, and maybe a little higher than this in the highway, so maybe around 28 MPG in the highway as a max. But how do these figures apply on the track? And now, let's give the R34 GT-R an official lap around the Futaro circuit. The official standard time is 2:19:60. With added up accidents and collisions, the final adjusted time is 2:19:60.
Holy shit! Let's get the fuck out of here right now.
You have to save the world!
What up, biatch?
Denied.
Shit, oh 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 shit.
Oh shit! Oh shit! Fuck him up!
The fuck is that?
Oh, 向かってくるのか。逃げずにこのディオに近づいてくるのか。せっかく祖父のジョセフが私のザワールドの正体を。
近づかなきゃてめえをぶちのめせないんでな。
ほうほう。では十分近づくがよい。
No, don't do it!
Hasta la vista, baby.
So, what are my final thoughts on the Skyline R34 GT-R? Well, for one thing, for bumps and just daily driving, it's not really a good car. It does cornering very well, it's not the greatest at speed, and stuff like that. I would highly suggest it as a weekend car if you want to take it on the weekend, but you're going to have to pay a bit since, like the Supra, you're not going to find a cheap one. And with that, it's time to end. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night.